Even in death, there could have remained mechanisms through which decisions made inside that marriage would continue affecting and controlling aspects of my life. Hi people, this is going to be a story time. But before I begin, I need to tell you something. This is not a short story, and this is not simply a story about a relationship that didn't work. This is a story about a warning I couldn't explain. A warning that came before I had the evidence to justify it. And years later, I would find myself looking at things that made me understand why, all those years before, something inside me had been telling me, do not go any further. This is a story about a man I met years ago. A man who appeared sincere. A man who appeared to want something genuine. A man who knew how to speak the language of love, commitment, spirituality, marriage, and the future. And the thing is, nothing dramatic had to happen for something inside me to begin reacting. My spirit was picking things my mind couldn't yet explain. How do you explain a warning when you don't yet have the evidence? How do you explain that something feels profoundly wrong when nothing dramatic has happened? How do you defend a decision based on something you can sense but cannot yet prove? And what happens when years later, circumstances begin answering the questions you couldn't answer before? That is part of what the story is about. What I eventually came to believe I was looking at was not simply a relationship. I believed I was looking at a strategy, and marriage would have been the mechanism that gave this man access to virtually every aspect of my life. And had that marriage happened, I came to believe that the relationship would not simply have left me broken or had broken. No, I believe it could have left me worse than he ever met me. And when I say worse, I mean potentially unable to rebuild my life back to what it had been before I met him. That is how serious the implications became to me. Because by the time I began putting the pieces together, I realized something frightening. Had I gone through with it, by the time I understood the full implication of what I had entered, living may no longer have been simple. I may not have had many options. I may simply have had to stay. And when I eventually understood what I believed was being constructed around me, I came to another realization that was even more chilling. Even in death, oh my goodness, even in death, there could have remained mechanisms through which decisions made inside that marriage would continue affecting and controlling aspects of my life. Think about that, because I had to. I cannot properly explain what that realization did to me. It shook me to my core, but it also took me back to the warning, back to the things I had felt before I could explain them, back to the moments when my spirit appeared to know something my conscious mind did not yet know. And suddenly, I was forced to ask myself, what if that feeling wasn't fear? What if it wasn't anxiety? What if it wasn't imagining things? What if I had been warned? And this is why I am finally telling the story. But here is the interesting thing. I never wanted to tell it. I have a very close aunt who knows the story. She knew what happened, and she even knew the man in question. And after watching everything unfold and seeing how it eventually ended, she pleaded with me to tell the story publicly. She told me, look, women need to hear this, because there are women who will benefit from what I learned. And eventually I agreed, but I had a major concern. This story is complicated. It has layers. There are things that happened at the beginning that will only make sense when you understand what happened much later. There are conversations that appeared completely innocent when they happened, but when other pieces eventually fell into place, those same conversations took on an entirely different meaning. And there were things I felt long before I understood why I was feeling them. That is why this series is called The Warning I Couldn't Explain. Because before I could explain what was wrong, I believe I had already been warned, and I know how the internet works. Someone watches part 6 without watching part 1. Someone watches part 10 without understanding what happened in part 3. Someone hears one sentence without knowing the context behind it. And suddenly people are arguing about a story they don't actually understand. So before I told the story online, I decided to take the longer route. I wrote the entire thing down, structurally, from beginning to end. That became my book, The Strategy of Love. It's available on Amazon, Google Books, and Apple Books. So anyone who wants to understand the story from beginning to end in the order that everything happened, right? You can pick the book up, you can read it there. And now that the complete story exists in a structured form, I feel comfortable coming online talking about it, because this is not merely a relationship story. And the book itself is not merely a story about a man. It is a book about discernment. It is about learning to understand people beyond what they say. It is about paying attention to patterns. It is about understanding how seemingly insignificant conversations can sometimes reveal enormous things. It is about identity. It is about spirituality. It is about manipulation. It is about power. It is about the Holy Spirit. It is about those whispers that sometimes the whispers we sometimes dismiss because we cannot explain them logically. And it is about what can happen when another human being sees access to you, not simply as love, but as strategy. So as I tell the story here, we are going to go deep. We are going to talk about how we met, the first warning, why I walked away the first time, what happened years later, how we found ourselves speaking again, what he said, what I noticed, the things that initially appeared harmless, the things that didn't sit right with me, the questions I started asking, the psychological dynamics, the spiritual dimension, the things I discovered, the things that shook me, the things I deliberately played along with because I needed to understand what I was actually dealing with, how everything began unraveling, how I eventually exposed him to himself, how it ended, and most importantly, the lessons, because there are many, too many. But before I end this introduction, there is something I particularly want to say to women. Hi people, this is going to be a story time, but before I begin, I need to tell you something. This is not a short story, and this is not simply a story about a relationship that didn't work. This is a story about a warning I couldn't explain. A warning that came before I had the evidence to justify it. And years later, I would find myself looking at things that made me understand why, all those years before, something inside me had been telling me, do not go any further. This is a story about a man I met years ago. A man who appeared sincere. A man who appeared to want something genuine. A man who knew how to speak the language of love, commitment, spirituality, marriage, and the future. And the thing is, nothing dramatic had to happen for something inside me to begin reacting. My spirit was picking things my mind couldn't yet explain. And that distinction is going to become very important as the story unfolds. Because one of the deepest lessons this experience taught me is that sometimes discernment arrives before explanation. Sometimes you know something is wrong before you can articulate what is wrong. Sometimes your body is reacting while your mind is still trying to gather evidence. And sometimes the Holy Spirit is whispering while everything you can physically see is telling you. But what is the problem? Are you sure you're not overthinking? That was one of the most difficult parts of this experience for me. Because how do you explain a warning when you don't yet have the evidence? How do you explain that something feels profoundly wrong when nothing dramatic has happened? How do you defend a decision based on something you can sense but cannot yet prove? And what happens when years later, circumstances begin answering the questions you couldn't answer before? That is part of what the story is about. Because eventually, I began to see things that shook me to my core. What I eventually came to believe I was looking at was not simply a relationship. I believed I was looking at a strategy, and marriage would have been the mechanism that gave this man access to virtually every aspect of my life. Spiritually, financially, psychologically, emotionally, practically. I mean, every aspect you can think of. And had that marriage happened, I came to believe that the relationship would not simply have left me broken or heartbroken. No, I believe it could have left me worse than he ever met me. And when I say worse, I mean potentially unable to rebuild my life back to what it had been before I met him. That is how serious the implications became to me. Because by the time I began putting the pieces together, I realized something frightening. Had I gone through with it, by the time I understood the full implication of what I had entered, living may no longer have been simple. I may not have had many options. I may simply have had to stay. And when I eventually understood what I believed was being constructed around me, I came to another realization that was even more chilling. Even in death, I mean, oh my goodness, even in death, there could have remained mechanisms through which decisions made inside that marriage would continue affecting and controlling aspects of my life. Think about that, because I had to. And when the pieces finally came together, I cannot properly explain what that realization did to me. It shook me to my core, but it also took me back to the warning, back to the things I had felt before I could explain them, back to the moments when my spirit appeared to know something my conscious mind did not yet know. And suddenly, I was forced to ask myself, what if that feeling wasn't fear? What if it wasn't anxiety? What if it wasn't imagining things? What if I had been warned? And this is why I am finally telling the story. But here is the interesting thing. I never wanted to tell it. I didn't even want to write a book about it. To me, it was simply an experience I had survived, an experience that taught me extremely profound lessons about people, relationships, discernment, spirituality, identity, manipulation, power, and the danger of taking appearances at face value. And I thought I would just leave it there. But I have a very close aunt who knows the story. She knew what happened, and she even knew the man in question. And after watching everything unfold and seeing how it eventually ended, she pleaded with me to tell the story publicly. She told me, look, women need to hear this, because there are women who will benefit from what I learned. And eventually I agreed, but I had a major concern. This story is complicated. It has layers. There are things that happened at the beginning that will only make sense when you understand what happened much later. There are conversations that appeared completely innocent when they happened, but when other pieces eventually fell into place, those same conversations took on an entirely different meaning. And there were things I felt long before I understood why I was feeling them. That is why this series is called The Warning I Couldn't Explain. Because before I could explain what was wrong, I believe I had already been warned, and I know how the internet works. Someone watches part 6 without watching part 1. Someone watches part 10 without understanding what happened in part 3. Someone hears one sentence without knowing the context behind it. And suddenly people are arguing about a story they don't actually understand. So before I told the story online, I decided to take the longer route. I wrote the entire thing down, structurally, from beginning to end. That became my book, The Strategy of Love. It's available on Amazon, Google Books, and Apple Books. So anyone who wants to understand the story from beginning to end in the order that everything happened, right? You can pick the book up, you can read it there. And now that the complete story exists in a structured form, I feel comfortable coming online talking about it, because this is not merely a relationship story. And the book itself is not merely a story about a man. It is a book about discernment. It is about learning to understand people beyond what they say. It is about paying attention to patterns. It is about understanding how seemingly insignificant conversations can sometimes reveal enormous things. It is about identity. It is about spirituality. It is about manipulation. It is about power. It is about the Holy Spirit. It is about those whispers that sometimes, the whispers we sometimes dismiss because we cannot explain them logically. And it is about what can happen when another human being sees access to you, not simply as love, but as strategy. So as I tell the story here, we are going to go deep. We are going to talk about how we met, the first warning, why I walked away the first time, what happened years later, how we found ourselves speaking again, what he said, what I noticed, the things that initially appeared harmless, the things that didn't sit right with me, the questions I started asking, the psychological dynamics, the spiritual dimension, the things I discovered, the things that shook me, the things I deliberately played along with because I needed to understand what I was actually dealing with, how everything began unraveling, how I eventually exposed him to himself, how it ended, and most importantly, the lessons, because there are many, too many. But before I end this introduction, there is something I particularly want to say to women. Please listen to me carefully. You may be a genuinely sincere person. You may have a lot of love to give. You may approach relationships honestly. You may not be calculating. You may not be looking for what you can extract from another human being. But because this is who you are, it becomes very easy to project yourself onto other people. You think, I am genuine, so this person must be genuine too. I want love, so surely this person wants love too. I am approaching this relationship with good intentions, so why would someone approach me with anything different? But life has taught me something. That is not always the case. That is not always the case. Two people can be standing inside what appears to be the same relationship while pursuing two completely different objectives. You can be looking at love. Someone else can be looking at access. You can be thinking about partnership. Someone else can be thinking about positioning. You can be thinking about building a life together. Someone else can be calculating what proximity to you could eventually give them. And that is why discernment is so important. Because people don't always arrive looking dangerous. Some people know the language. They know what to say. They know how to appear sincere. They know how to present themselves as spiritual. They know how to appear patient. They may not even rush you. They may not come on too strongly. They may give you all the things you've been told are signs that someone is genuine, and still, something may not be right. And sometimes, the thing that exposes what is wrong are so subtle that if you are not paying attention, you will miss them. Some of the red flags I encountered came up in ordinary, everyday conversations. Things another person could easily have laughed at. Things someone could have dismissed. Things you could explain away. Things that could make you say, oh, that's probably not what he meant. But later, when I understood the bigger picture, some of those conversations no longer looked as innocent to me as they had at the beginning. I began to see ideas being introduced, expectations being planted, boundaries being tested. And had I not been deeply in touch with myself, my instincts, my spirit, the Holy Spirit within me, I believe I could have missed a lot. And this is where the story becomes bigger than this man, because I began to recognize something about my own life. There had been other moments when I was about to make a decision, or someone was trying to pressure me into something, and I could almost feel the consequences of that decision before I made it. It was as though my body was already telling me, if you go this way, you are going to pay for it. And there were times when I didn't trust myself. I called it fear. I dismissed it. I rationalized it away. I went ahead anyway. And I paid the price. In full, I paid the price. So this experience forced me to confront something. Perhaps every warning doesn't arrive with evidence attached. Perhaps sometimes God gives you the warning first and understanding comes later. And I learned that when I experienced that deep internal resistance, I need to stop. I need to pray. I need to pay attention. I need to investigate. I need to give myself time, because I would rather pause and discover that I was mistaken than override something important simply because I couldn't produce enough evidence for that person. If you get what I mean. That is one of the greatest lessons I took from that experience. Listen to yourself. Listen to your body. Listen to your spirit. Listen to the Holy Spirit. Do not disconnect from yourself simply because someone had entered your life offering you the possibility of love. And please do not rush. Time is one of your greatest allies. Sometimes time will tell you what words never will. Let people reveal themselves. Watch, listen, observe, pray, and question everything. Question everything. I don't care how trustworthy someone appears. I don't care how spiritual they present themselves to be. I don't care how accomplished they are. I don't care how convincing their story sounds. I don't care how wonderful the connection feels. Question things. Do your own research. Seek truth. Because one of the greatest mistakes you can make is assuming that someone's presentation is proof of their intention. It isn't. It isn't. There are wolves in sheep's clothing, and wolves in sheep's clothing do not introduce themselves as wolves. That's the entire point of the clothing. Sometimes what protects you is time. Sometimes it's discernment. Sometimes it's a solid sense of identity. Sometimes it's your relationship with God. And sometimes it is simply your willingness to admit, I cannot explain this yet, but something about this does not sit right with me. And I am not going to silence that warning simply because I want this relationship to work. And this brings me to something else I cannot emphasize enough. Please stop idolizing relationships. Do not make having a relationship the center of your existence. Do not build your identity on whether or not a man is standing beside you. Do not allow yourself to believe that being chosen by somebody automatically means you have been blessed by them. Sometimes being rejected is protection. Sometimes walking away is protection, and sometimes what looks like an opportunity for love is an opportunity for someone else to gain access. Look, if at any point in my life I had believed that my value depended on having a man beside me, if I had believed that being unmarried made me less than, if I had been desperate to make a relationship work simply because I wanted to say I had one, I believe I could have walked directly into that trap, and it could have been disastrous. Absolutely disastrous. And there is one more thing I want women to understand before we begin this story properly. Never assume that because a man appears accomplished, successful, or well put together, he therefore cannot be parasitic. No. Please remove that idea from your mind. A man's accomplishments do not automatically tell you what his intentions are toward you. His external success does not automatically mean he cannot be calculating what he would gain through access to your life. His status does not exempt him from being parasitic. His education does not exempt him. His career does not exempt him. His money does not exempt him. His spirituality does not exempt him. His reputation does not exempt him. Sometimes you have to stop looking at what somebody possesses and start paying attention. Start paying very close attention to what they are positioning themselves to access. There is a difference. And as this story unfolds, you will understand why I am saying that. Because when I eventually put everything together, I realized that what I thought I was looking at in the beginning was not what I believed I was looking at by the end. There is something I need to explain, and I need to explain it now, because as the story unfolds, there are going to be moments when some of you will probably be looking at your screens thinking, what? Why didn't you say anything? Why didn't you get angry? Why didn't you walk away right there? Some of you may even think, were you desperate? Were you not seeing what was happening? Or if you're less charitable, you'd say, were you dumb? And I understand why somebody watching the story from the outside might think those questions, because there were things this man eventually said to me that were outrageous. There were things he asked for that were outrageous. There were boundaries he attempted to test that under ordinary circumstances would make somebody immediately flare up. There were moments when the red flag wasn't even a little red flag. It was practically waving itself in my face, and yet I remained extraordinarily calm. I exercised a level of restraint that, looking back, even I have had to think deeply about it. So, before I begin telling you what happened, I need you to understand something. My restraint was not compliance. My restraint was not desperation. My restraint was not an absence of intelligence, and my kindness was not permission. Those distinctions are extremely important, because if you don't understand them, you may misunderstand parts of the story. And the thing is, both the first and the second time this man came into my life, I wasn't somebody desperately looking for a relationship to complete me. I already knew who I was. I had already lived. I had already experienced a bad marriage. I had already been forced to confront parts of myself that needed healing. And most importantly, there came a point during this experience when internally I already knew this was not going to work. So, what you are going to hear as the story unfolds is not a story of a woman desperately trying to convince a man to choose her. That's not what was happening. And that's precisely why some of my reactions may surprise you. Because there were moments when I wasn't reacting. I was observing. There were moments when I wasn't arguing. I was listening. There were moments when I could have confronted something immediately, and I didn't. I allowed the conversation to continue. I allowed him to speak. Sometimes I even played along, not because I had surrendered my mind to him, but because I wanted to understand what I was looking at. How far does this go? What exactly is being attempted here? What does this person actually believe? What happens if I don't interrupt him? What will he reveal if I allow him to keep talking? And there is something else I have thought about deeply. I actually do believe that there was a spiritual dimension to that restraint, because remember where this story began. Years earlier, before I had evidence, before anything dramatic happened, something in my spirit reacted strongly to the idea of continuing a relationship with this man. Strongly enough that I walked away. And then years later, another opportunity came for me to encounter him again. And I have wondered many times, why? Why did that door open again? Why was I allowed to see more? And one of the conclusions I have come to is that perhaps there were several things happening at once. Perhaps it was a test of how rooted I had become in God, a test of how much healing had actually taken place in me after what I had experienced previously, a test of whether I now knew myself well enough not to abandon myself simply because somebody was offering me a relationship. Because healing is very easy to talk about when nothing is testing it. Boundaries are very easy to claim when nobody is pushing them. Discernment sounds wonderful in theory, but when life places something in front of you that looks attractive, something that speaks the right language, something that appears respectable, something that could potentially give you something society tells women they should desperately want, and then the question becomes, have you actually healed? Do you actually know who you are? Are you actually rooted in God? Or will you abandon everything you've learned just because somebody says, I want to marry you? Those are very difficult questions, and I believe this experience forced me to answer them. But I also believe something else. I believe God may have allowed me to remain in that situation long enough to see the picture more completely. Not necessarily to stay permanently, not to submit myself to destruction, but long enough to see. Because had I reacted to the first outrageous statement, had I slammed the door immediately, had I become emotional every single time something didn't make sense, there are things I might never have discovered. There are conversations that might never have happened. There are things this man might never have said. There are patterns I might never have seen. There are things I eventually understood only because I had allowed enough information to accumulate. And sometimes when a person believes you are not seeing what they are doing, they become bolder. That's something I learned. When somebody mistakes your restraint for ignorance, they may reveal more. When somebody mistakes your patience for weakness, they may push further. When somebody mistakes your humanity for desperation, they may become increasingly audacious. And when somebody mistakes your kindness for compliance, sometimes they tell on themselves. Now, this brings me on to something I need to explain about myself. I understand the difference between being nice and being kind. Yeah, and I think we confuse those two words far too often. Niceness is not one of the fruits of the Spirit. Kindness is. There is a difference. A kind person can be nice, but a kind person does not have to perform niceness at all times in order to remain kind. Sometimes kindness has boundaries. Sometimes kindness says no. Sometimes kindness walks away. Sometimes kindness tells you the truth you don't want to hear. Sometimes kindness refuses to enable you. Sometimes kindness leaves you to experience the consequences of your own behavior. And sometimes kindness becomes extremely firm. So when I tell you that I am a kind person, I am not telling you that I am somebody who smiles through everything, agrees with everybody, and allows people to do whatever they want with me. No. If you know me, you know that when it comes to certain things, I am not nice. I can be extremely firm. I can make a decision and stand by it. I can close a door. I can say no. I can remove myself. And none of that makes me less kind, because kindness is deeper than social pleasantness. Kindness is about the condition of your heart. It is about how you recognize another person's humanity. It is about how you treat people when there is nothing you need from them. It is about the clarity of your intentions. And when I deal with another human being, I try to deal with them with clarity of heart, clarity of intention. If I do something for you, I don't necessarily need something back. If I treat you with dignity, it's not because I am negotiating for your approval. If I recognize your humanity, it doesn't mean I need you. If I am generous toward you, it doesn't mean I am trying to buy your affection. If I am patient with you, it doesn't mean you have power over me. And if I exercise restraint, it doesn't mean I don't see you. And ironically, this quality has sometimes become one of the greatest ways people reveal themselves to me, because certain people do not know what to do with genuine kindness, especially manipulative people. They don't understand doing something simply because it is right. They don't understand treating another human being well without an agenda. So when they encounter someone who does that, they begin interpreting that person through the architecture of their own mind. They think, why is she doing this? She must need something. She must really want me. She must be desperate. She must be easy. And because they would only behave that way if they wanted something, they assume you must want something too. That is projection. And sometimes kindness in the presence of a manipulative person becomes extremely revealing, because rather than receiving kindness with gratitude, they begin calculating what else they can extract from you. Rather than seeing humanity, they see opportunity. Rather than seeing respect, they see access. Rather than seeing restraint, they see compliance. Rather than seeing generosity, they see weakness. And that's when they begin to push just a little further, then a little further, and then further still, until eventually you are sitting there thinking, you genuinely believe I am a fool. And that became part of what happened in the story. This man saw my kindness. I believe he interpreted some of it as desperation. He saw the way I recognized his humanity. He saw the way I treated him with dignity. He saw my restraint. And at different points, I came to believe he interpreted my restraint as compliance, and I think that interpretation emboldened him, because some of the things he said became more audacious, some of the things he asked became more revealing, some of the boundaries he attempted to test became more outrageous. And the fascinating part was I was watching, I was listening, I was learning, and sometimes I was deliberately refusing to give the reaction that might have made him retreat because I wanted to see. I wanted to understand the depth of what I was dealing with. And this is why, as you listen to this story, I need you to resist the temptation to judge every moment individually. Don't hear one conversation and immediately decide you understand the entire picture. Watch the pattern, because I was watching the pattern too. And the picture did not arrive all at once. It arrived in pieces. One conversation here, one request there, one strange statement there, one boundary test, one contradiction, one casual remark that sounded harmless until something else happened months later. One thing that didn't quite make sense, then another, until eventually the dots began connecting. And there is another reason this matters to me spiritually. I had been through experiences before where I felt something strongly inside me about a decision, something telling me, don't do this, don't go there, this is going to hurt you. And because I couldn't produce evidence, I sometimes dismissed it. I thought it was fear. I thought maybe I was overthinking. I thought perhaps I needed to be more open-minded. And there were times when I ignored that internal warning, and I paid dearly for it in full. So I believe this experience also taught me how to recognize the language through which God sometimes communicates with me. Not everything arrives as a dramatic voice from heaven. Sometimes it is an uneasiness you cannot shake. Sometimes it is a restraint. Sometimes it is an absence of peace. Sometimes your entire being is resisting something your logical mind is still trying to justify. And I've learned not to mock that anymore. I have learned to stop, to pray, to watch, to give things time, and to understand that I do not owe anybody a catastrophic decision simply because I cannot yet produce enough evidence to justify saying no. Let me say that again. You do not owe anyone a catastrophic decision because you cannot yet explain your hesitation. Sometimes you need time. Sometimes you need distance. Sometimes you need prayer. And sometimes you need to allow people enough room to reveal themselves. And there is another side to that. And I need to be very clear about it. Discernment does not mean deliberately placing yourself in danger just to gather more information. Please understand that. You don't need to stay somewhere unsafe so that you can prove to yourself that you were right. You don't need to sacrifice yourself to complete an investigation. You don't need to tolerate abuse in the name of spirituality. That is not what I am saying. I am explaining my experience, and I have come to understand the unusual restraint I exhibited during portions of it. Because when I look back, I don't see a woman who didn't understand anything. I see a woman who was being shown things in layers. And I believe there were moments when God held my reaction long enough for me to see what I needed to see. Because sometimes immediate reactions ends a conversation, but restraint allows revelation. Sometimes confrontation makes a person hide, but silence makes them comfortable enough to expose themselves. And sometimes when somebody believes they have successfully mistaken your kindness for weakness, they become careless. That carelessness can tell you everything. Remember this: when you hear me remain calm, don't automatically assume I was comfortable. When you hear me continue a conversation, don't automatically assume I agreed. When you hear me ask another question, don't assume I hadn't already noticed the first problem. When you hear me laugh at something outrageous, don't automatically assume I thought it was funny. When you hear me play along, don't assume I had surrendered something I was observing. Sometimes I was observing. Sometimes I was testing what I was hearing against what I already knew. Sometimes I was praying. Sometimes I was watching. And sometimes I was simply allowing the person to finish revealing himself. Because there is a difference between not seeing something and seeing it so clearly that you no longer need to fight with it. There is a difference between compliance and restraint. There is a difference between desperation and kindness. There is a difference between being nice and being kind. And there is an enormous difference between somebody having access to your humanity and somebody having ownership of you. And there is something I need you to know about this man before I continue. I'm deliberately not going to tell you what country he's from. And throughout the story, I'm also going to avoid identifying the country where I live. Those details are not necessary. But there is one detail that is necessary. The This man was already resident in what people will describe as a developed first world country. And I was also living in a developed first world country. I am telling you that because as the story unfolds, I don't want anybody reducing what happened to the stereotype that this kind of dynamics only involved desperate men from poorer countries trying to gain access to women living in wealthier countries. No, that wasn't the situation. He was an accomplished man, educated, well-spoken, established in his own right, significantly older than I was. He had come to the country where I lived to study and obtain further qualifications. And that was when I met him. It was an ordinary day, an ordinary public setting, nothing dramatic, nothing that announced, pay attention, this person is going to become a subject of an entire book one day. I simply met a man, and he was very charming, warm, jovial, well-spoken, and interesting to talk to. He knew how to carry a conversation. He spoke the language of faith, family, commitment, love, marriage, the future. And at that point in my life, I wasn't looking for someone to complete me. That's important. I had recently come out of a bad marriage. I was rebuilding. I was working. I was healing. I was raising my children. And I was writing my first book. That book would become Redefine Your Narrative, Rediscover Your Identity and Working Purpose. And the irony of what I was writing at the time is not lost on me now, because I was writing about hidden psychological warfare, spiritual abuse, identity, the things women sometimes experience but struggle to find language for. My head was full. I had lived through things. I had questions. I had observations. I had thoughts I needed to put somewhere. I was trying to create language for experiences that can be incredibly difficult to name while you are inside them. So when this man met me, he didn't meet an empty woman sitting around waiting for somebody to give her a life. I already had a life. I was rebuilding one. I wasn't close to love. I wasn't close to friendship. I wasn't saying nobody can ever come near me again. No. If something genuine came along, I was open to seeing where it went, but I wasn't vacant. My heart had borders now, and that distinction matters. So we began talking, and initially I enjoyed speaking with him, but very early on I noticed something. No matter where our conversations began, they had an extraordinary tendency to end up in the same place. Schmecks, again and again and again. And I needed to understand what bothered me about this. It wasn't simply that two divorced adults were having adult conversations. We had both been married before, right? We were grown people. I wasn't scandalized by the existence of schmecks. This wasn't the issue. It was the philosophy underneath the way he talked about it that began making me uncomfortable, because he didn't seem to speak about schmecks simply as intimacy between two people who loved each other. The way he spoke about it increasingly sounded to me like leverage, like power, like something a person could become so good at providing that another human being would find it difficult to leave them. And one particular thing he repeatedly said stayed with me. He would say that if a man truly knows how to please a woman schmectually, that woman will find it very difficult to leave him, even when other things in the relationship aren't right. And I remember challenging the idea once. I asked him something along the lines of, what if the man is abusive? Because in my mind, surely there has to be a point where whatever happens in the bedroom becomes irrelevant. If somebody is hurt, you leave. That's common sense. But he disagreed. He told me there are women in terrible relationships who remain because of what the man gives them sexually. And that troubled me. It troubled me deeply, because I wasn't hearing schmecks can strengthen intimacy between two people. I was hearing something different. What I was hearing was, if you can satisfy somebody strongly enough, you can make leaving you difficult even when the relationship itself is bad. And I remember thinking, why does your mind work like this? I didn't say that to him. Remember, I told you before the series began, I listened, I observed. I didn't interrupt every uncomfortable statement with an argument. I didn't accuse him of anything. No, I didn't judge him. I didn't say, this is a red flag. I simply took note, because at that stage, I was still getting to know him, and people are different. People express themselves differently. I thought maybe this was simply his way of speaking. Maybe I was misunderstanding him. Maybe because we were both adults who had previously been married, he felt comfortable speaking openly. So I gave the conversation room, but it kept happening. Schmecks, schmecks, schmecks. Eventually, I became so uncomfortable with the pattern that I mentioned it to somebody at work. I remember telling my colleague, there is this man I'm talking to. He doesn't live here at the moment, but every time we speak, somehow the conversation comes back to schmecks. And then I said something I remember very clearly. I remember saying, I don't think this man has anything to offer me. That was genuinely how I felt, because I wasn't leaving our conversations emotionally stimulated. I wasn't thinking, wow, that was an interesting perspective. I wasn't discovering layers of emotional depth. Eventually, I started feeling as though everything descended into carnality, the flesh, make sure performance, what he could do, how desirable he was, how difficult he was to forget. And then he began telling me stories about women from his past. According to him, even his former wife still wanted sexual access to him. He told me that she would contact him wanting to be intimate with him, but that he refused. And there was another former partner. This was somebody he had been in a serious relationship with after his divorce. They had lived together. They had bought a house together. They had apparently been moving toward marriage. But according to him, the relationship ended after he discovered she had been unfaithful. And then he told me something else. According to him, this woman later traveled from the country where they had lived to the country where I was living, the same country where he had come to study. And he told me that she gave him a substantial amount of money and was essentially pleading for another intimate encounter with him. He said he refused. Again, I listened. I wasn't there. I couldn't independently verify those stories. So I wasn't going to treat everything somebody told me about their previous relationships as established fact. But I was paying attention to why he was telling me these stories, because there seemed to be a recurring message underneath them. Women couldn't let go of him. Women came back. Women pursued him. Women would cross borders. Women would spend money. Women would tolerate things. And the implied explanation always seemed to come back to his sexual ability. And I remember thinking, what exactly are you trying to communicate to me? Are you telling me about your past? Or are you advertising something? Are you sharing experiences? Or are you establishing an expectation? Are you telling me who these women were? Or are you telling me what you expect me to eventually become? I didn't know. So I said very little. I listened. And this is where something I said in the previous video becomes important. Restraint is not compliance. Because I think sometimes people expect discernment to look dramatic. They think the moment you notice something strange, you have to stand up, point your finger and announce, red flag. That's not always how I operate. Sometimes I become quieter because I want to hear the rest of the sentence. And at that stage, I didn't have a case against this man. I wasn't trying to build one. I simply had questions and I was taking mental notes. But here is the thing. Outside of those conversations, he was incredibly easy to like. He was warm, funny, jovial. He was charming, accomplished, well-spoken. He could talk about God. He could talk about family. He could talk about commitment. He could talk about marriage. He could sound incredibly sincere. And that is precisely why discernment can be difficult, because human beings rarely arrive as one thing. Somebody can make you laugh and still say something that troubles you. Somebody can appear spiritually grounded and still hold ideas you find deeply unsettling. Someone can be accomplished and still make you question their motives. Somebody can be incredibly pleasant to be around and your spirit can still refuse to settle. So we became friends, good friends actually. And shortly after his examinations, he returned to the country where he lived. But the relationship didn't end. If anything, right, it intensified. We began speaking over the phone, video calls, regular calls, long conversations. And because of the significant time difference between our countries, our waking hours overlapped in an unusual way. When he was winding down, I was working. When I was awake, he wanted to talk. And then he wanted to talk some more and some more. And gradually, the warmth became a lot. The compliments became constant. And these weren't ordinary compliments. They were disproportionate, over the top. The kind of compliments where you're just there thinking, okay, calm down, please. Just calm down. You don't even know me that well. I knew I was being gassed up. Like, gassed up. I could feel it. But again, I said nothing. I observed. And then the calls became almost relentless. There was hardly any breathing room. If I was awake, it felt as though he wanted to access me. Conversation, attention, presence, hours and hours. Anyway, thank God for headphones because I could continue doing other things while we spoke. But after those conversations, I would sometimes feel exhausted. And looking back, one thing I find interesting about the level of intensity is how little room it leaves you to process. Conversation, compliment, call, another call, emotion, another conversation, another compliment. Another call. Everything keeps moving. There is very little silence, and silence is where you think. Silence is where you replay what somebody said 3 hours ago and suddenly realize, wait a minute, Silence is where your body catches up with the conversation. Silence is where discernment sometimes gets loud, and I wasn't getting much silence. Today, people would readily describe that kind of overwhelming early intensity as love bombing. At the time, I simply knew it was becoming suffocating, and something inside me was beginning to resist. Not dramatically, right? Not yet. Just enough for me to notice. And here is what makes the beginning of the story so interesting to me now. Nothing catastrophic had happened. He hadn't screamed at me. He hadn't threatened me. There had been no enormous dramatic event I could take to someone and say, look, here is the proof. This man is bad for me. Instead, I had fragments. The repeated conversations about schmecks. The idea that schmexual satisfaction could make a woman remain even in a bad relationship. The stories about women supposedly being unable to let go of him. The intensity, the excessive compliments, the constant access to my time, and a feeling, just a feeling. But I didn't yet understand what that feeling was trying to tell me. And then the conversations began changing. The questions became different. He started asking about my work, my position, my benefits, my pension, my capacity. Marriage started entering the conversations with increasing urgency. Money entered the conversation. My home entered the conversation. And then he made a comment about divorced women with children that stopped me internally because I was a divorced woman with children. And suddenly, some of the things I had been quietly recording in my mind started sitting beside each other. Not enough yet for me to make an accusation, but enough for me to begin asking myself, what exactly is this man assessing? And while all of that was happening, there was another shift beginning. The questions started changing. They became more specific, more practical. And looking back now, some of those questions feel very different to me than they did in the moment. At first, it sounded casual. He would ask, what's your job title again? Then something like, you must get good benefits there, like health benefits, dental care, pension, things like that. And he would say it lightly, almost conversationally, nothing dramatic, nothing you could point to and say, there. That's the problem. Because there is a difference between someone being interested in what you do and someone seeming interested in what your position gives you access to. And I remember feeling as though he wasn't simply trying to understand my work. It felt like he was weighing capacity, my capacity, what I earned, what came with my job, what kind of stability I had, what kind of infrastructure existed around my life. Now, did I accuse him of that? No. I didn't, because remember, I was still getting to know this person. I didn't want to create motives where there might not be any. So I listened. I answered what I wanted to answer, and I kept observing. Then one day, during one of our conversations, I said something very ordinary. I said, when are you coming over again? I'd like to see you. That was it. Nothing dramatic. I wasn't declaring undying love. I wasn't saying I couldn't live without him. I simply wanted to see him again in person because we had been speaking so much over the phone, and sometimes proximity clarifies. You know, you can talk to someone for hours on the phone and still not know how you actually feel around them physically. So I wanted to see him, observe, feel the energy again, see whether there was really something there worth exploring. And the moment I said it, he responded, "Aha, Mutimue." That is Yoruba. And in that context, it was basically like, I've got you now, as in the person who has been holding back has finally fallen. And I remember thinking, what do you mean? What do you mean you've got me? Because that was not how I was experiencing the moment. I had simply said I wanted to see him, but his response told me something about how he interpreted it. To him, he seemed to register a victory, like something had shifted, like he had finally secured something again. I said very little, but I noticed it. And then something happened almost immediately after. I believe it was the following day or very shortly afterwards. He told me his results were out and he needed to come back to the country where I lived to check them. But he didn't have the money to travel. Now, I listened carefully to the wording. He did not directly ask me for money. He didn't say, can you buy my ticket? He didn't say, can you lend me the money? He simply created the information. My results are out. I need to come over. I would use the opportunity to see you, but I don't have the money right now. And then silence. To me, that silence felt engineered because I had just told him I wanted to see him. So now, suddenly, an opportunity had appeared for him to come. And the only thing standing between that opportunity and reality was money. My money, if I choose to volunteer it. And I remember thinking, so this is where I am supposed to say, don't worry, I'll pay for your ticket. I didn't. I said nothing. I didn't offer. I did not rescue the conversation. I allowed the silence to remain exactly where he placed it, because I'm just getting to know you. Why would I be financing international travel for a man I barely know? A substantial amount of money, right? For you to travel across countries, to supposedly check examination results. And another thing crossed my mind. If these were academic results from an institution you had attended, why would you need to travel internationally simply to check them? Surely there would be an online portal, some form of communication, a way to obtain them remotely. So I did not understand the logic. But again, I didn't argue. I didn't say, you are lying. I didn't accuse him of trying to manipulate me. I simply declined to participate. And this is something that is going to come up repeatedly in the story. People sometimes assume a boundary has to arrive with a speech. It doesn't. Sometimes your boundary is simply no, or even silence. You don't have to explain every no. You don't have to rescue every awkward pause someone creates in the hope that you will volunteer something. And I didn't. Then another conversation came. He said that the next time he came to the country where I lived, he would like to stay at my house. Again, no. Absolutely not. And I told him why. I have young children, children who were watching me, children who were learning from the decisions I made. I was not going to bring a man I was still getting to know into my house and have him stay there. That was not happening. And I didn't care how charming he was. I didn't care how much we talked. I didn't care how serious he believed things might eventually become. There are lines I wasn't willing to blur. My home was not one of them. My children were another. And what I was beginning to notice was this. The relationship was still young, but the access being discussed was becoming very adult very quickly. My finances, my home, my space, my resources, my future, marriage. And at the time, I didn't yet know what to make of it, but my body was noticing, my spirit was noticing, even when my mind was still trying to remain fair. Then a few days after the conversation about him not having money to travel, we were on the phone again, and he started telling me a story. He said, can you imagine these people in Africa? He told me that somebody he had not spoken to in decades had somehow gotten his number. And after all those years, the first thing this person apparently did was asking for money. I remember responding in an ordinary way you respond to something like that. Something like, wow, yes, these things happen. And the conversation continued. Then a few minutes later, he asked me something. He said, if I asked you as my wife to send money to someone in Africa, would you do it? My wife, but I'm not married to you. And I said, no. Immediately, no hesitation, no performance, no pretending, no, absolutely no. Because even in the hypothetical, the answer was clear to me. I wasn't going to become a financial extension of someone else's obligations because I was talking to them. If you want to support somebody, support them. But why am I automatically being positioned as the person who will fund whatever request you decide deserves funding? So I said no. And he laughed softly. Then he said, independent woman. I remember that. Independent woman. It was said almost playfully, but something about that phrase stayed with me because I wasn't trying to make a statement about independence. I wasn't waving a feminist flag at him. I had simply answered a question. Would you send money because your husband told you to? And mind you, I wasn't married to this person. It's even different if he was the husband. No, that was my answer. And his response told me that he had registered something, a boundary, a type of woman, a woman who would not automatically comply. And again, I took notes. Then came another conversation, and this one disturbed me in a different way. We were talking about his father. His mother had passed away, and his father was getting old. He spoke about wanting his father to marry again so that there would be somebody, taking care of him, someone to keep him company. That part made sense. Then he said something. He said he did not want his father to marry a divorcee with children. And I remember going quiet internally because I was a divorcee with children. The exact profile of woman he was describing as unsuitable for his father. And this same man was talking to me about marriage. So immediately, a contradiction opened up in my mind. You don't want your father to marry a divorced woman with children, but you want to marry a divorced woman with children? Why? Right? What exactly is different? But he wasn't finished. He said that if his father did marry such a woman, she needed to understand that there was nothing there for her to collect, nothing for her to take. And that sentence landed heavily because now I wasn't only hearing, I don't want my father to marry a divorcee. I was hearing, I am deeply alert to the possibility that a woman could marry a man for what she can access financially. That concern existed in him strongly. He He understood that possibility perfectly. He could imagine a woman entering marriage with calculation. He could imagine somebody thinking about property, money, inheritance, what she might gain. He understood the concept very well. And yet, the woman he was pursuing was a divorced woman with children. The same category of woman he seemed suspicious of around his own father. And I remember thinking, this is very interesting. Again, I didn't confront him. I didn't say, do you hear yourself? I didn't ask him to explain the hypocrisy. I did what I had been doing from the beginning. I listened. Because at this point, I was beginning to realize something. Sometimes the most revealing thing you can do in a conversation is let the person finish, because people often tell you what they believe when they think they are talking about someone else. They tell you how they see money. They tell you how they see marriage. They tell you how they see women, how they see access, how they see vulnerability, how they see people who have something to lose. And when you don't interrupt them, they sometimes give you more than they intended. So now, look at what I had. A man who repeatedly spoke about schmex as something powerful enough to make a woman remain. A man who told me stories about women supposedly unable to let go of him. A man asking about my job, my benefits, my pension. A man who, after I said I wanted to see him, very quickly presented me with a travel problem that money could solve. A man who wanted to stay in my home. A man asking whether, as his wife, I would send money when he instructed me to. A man who seemed to interpret my refusal as evidence that I was an independent woman. And a man who was deeply suspicious of a divorced woman with children marrying his father because she might have something to gain, while simultaneously pursuing marriage with a divorced woman with children. Me. Now, individually, every one of those things could potentially be explained away. And that is what makes certain pattern difficult to identify at the beginning. One thing by itself looks harmless, then another thing happens, and another, and another. At some point, you stop asking, can I explain each individual thing? And you start asking, what happens when I put all of those things in the same room? That is where I was beginning to arrive. I still didn't have enough evidence to make some grand declaration about who this man was, and I didn't want to, but I was becoming increasingly uncomfortable. And at the same time, the marriage conversations were accelerating. He wanted things to move quickly, and the faster he talked about marriage, the slower something inside me became. I wasn't excited. I wasn't feeling peace. I wasn't feeling, yes, this is where my life is supposed to go. I was feeling something else, something heavy, something I could not name. And eventually, that heaviness became dread. There was one particular evening when he started talking about marriage again, and while he was talking, something happened inside me. It was still difficult to explain. It felt as though my spirit went somewhere my body had not yet gone, into a future that had not happened. And somehow, I felt the consequences. I felt what it would be like to already be this man's wife, to be inside the marriage, to realize too late that my life had changed in ways I could not reverse, to understand that something was terribly wrong and have nowhere to go. It didn't feel like imagination. It didn't feel like ordinary nerves about marriage. It felt real, absolutely real, so real that I started crying. And that's where I'm going to stop, because part 1C is the moment the warning finally becomes impossible for me to ignore. The tears, the conversation, the fact that he thought that what I was feeling was probably connected to my previous marriage, and the fact that deep inside I knew it wasn't. It absolutely wasn't. It was him. And before I ended that relationship, I said something to this man that I had never rehearsed, something that came out of my mouth before I fully understood why I was saying it. I said, you can never truly know a man until you marry him and have nowhere else to go. And then I walked away. At the time, I thought it was the end of the story. It wasn't, because more than 3 years later, I was the one who said hello. By this point, something inside me was changing, not because one dramatic thing had happened, not because I had caught him in some outrageous act, not because I had proof of anything, but because the conversations were accumulating. The questions, the comments, the pressure around marriage, the strange contradictions, the way he spoke about schmex, the way he seemed to think about access, the way some of his questions landed in my spirit. And the more he talked about marriage, right, the less peace I had. That is the simplest way I can explain it. I was not excited. I was not feeling butterflies. I was not thinking, oh my goodness, maybe this is it. No, The more he talked about marrying me, the heavier I felt. And I need to explain why that confused me. Because on paper, there was nothing obvious enough for me to point to and say, this is why I need to run. He was accomplished. He was educated. He was older. He was articulate. He could be charming. He could be very funny. He could speak about God. He could speak about family. He could speak about commitment, right? He could sound like a man who knew exactly what he wanted. And ordinarily, people would tell you that those are good things. A man who knows what he wants. He's serious. He's not wasting time. He wants marriage. Then what's the problem? And I couldn't answer that question. That was the problem. I couldn't explain the problem. I just knew that something in me did not want to go forward. And the more he talked about marriage, the stronger that resistance became. It wasn't ordinary nervousness. It wasn't marriage is a big step, so I'm scared. I had been married before. I knew what marriage was. I knew the difference between healthy caution and dread. This felt like dread. A deep one. The kind that sits somewhere below the language. And I remember one particular conversation. We were speaking on the phone. And once again, marriage came up. He was talking. And while he was talking, something happened to me that I still find difficult to describe. I felt as though my spirit went ahead of me into a future I had not yet lived. And somehow I experienced it. Not as a thought. Not as a theory. Not as, what if this marriage goes bad? No. It felt like I was already there, like I had already married him, like I was already living inside the consequences. And what I felt was terrifying. I felt trapped. I felt depleted. I felt like my life had become something I couldn't recognize no longer. I felt as though I had entered a marriage and only afterwards discovered what I had actually entered. And by then, it was too late. I felt the helplessness of knowing your life has been altered in a way you cannot easily reverse. I felt the weight of realizing I should never have done this, but having nowhere to go, no easy exit, no way of simply returning to the person you were before. And the strange thing is, none of it had happened. I was still on the phone, still in my own life, still free, still unmarried to this man. And yet my body was reacting as though I was already living the aftermath. And I started crying. Not little tears. Even I was wondering why I was crying. I was genuinely crying. And of course he was confused. He asked me what was wrong. Why was I crying? And I couldn't properly explain it. What was I going to say? I feel like I have just lived through a marriage to you that has not yet happened yet, and it destroyed my life. How do you say that to someone? How do you defend that? How do you present evidence for something you have only felt? So I said things like, I don't think I'm ready for this. I don't think I can do this. And I think in his mind, he probably assumed it was my past, maybe trauma, maybe fear from my previous marriage. Maybe I was frightened of commitment. And I understand why he might have thought that. Because if someone has come out of a bad marriage and then becomes emotional when another marriage is being discussed, the easiest explanation is she's scared because of what happened before. But deep inside me, I knew that wasn't it. It wasn't my past. It was him. That was what I couldn't explain. I wasn't crying because I was afraid of marriage. I was crying because something in me was deeply afraid of marriage to this man. And I didn't have enough evidence to justify that distinction. That is why this part of the story matters so much to me. Because we were taught to distrust ourselves when we cannot produce a logical explanation. We were taught to say, maybe I am overthinking. Maybe I am projecting. Maybe I am being unfair or paranoid. Maybe this is just trauma. And sometimes, yes, those things can be true. Right? But sometimes your spirit is trying to tell you something before your mind has gathered enough information to form a case. And I believe that was what was happening to me. I had fragments, but my spirit seemed to be responding to the whole picture, a picture I could not yet see. And then something came out of my mouth. I did not plan it. I had never rehearsed it. I was never trying to sound profound. I wasn't trying to make a statement. It simply came out. I said to him, you can never truly know a man until you marry him and have nowhere else to go. Even now, I remember that sentence because at the time, I did not fully understand why I said it. But something in me understood it. Something in me seemed to know that the danger was not simply, what if this man disappoints you? It was deeper. It was, what if you only discover who he truly is after he has gained enough access to your life that living becomes costly? What if you only understand the architecture after you are already inside it? What if the version of the man you meet before marriage is not the version you will have to survive after marriage? What if the real danger is not what you can see while you are still free, but what becomes possible once you are bound. That was what the sentence felt like. Even though I did not have the language for all of that then, I just knew I could not continue. So I told him I could not do it. I couldn't do it. I told him I don't think I was ready. I told him we needed to part ways. Not as enemies. I wasn't angry. I wasn't trying to punish him. I wasn't making accusations. I simply knew I can't go any further with you. And I ended it. I walked away. And I want you to understand how strange that decision must have looked from the outside. Nothing catastrophic had happened. There had been no huge scandal, no explosive confrontation, no smoking gun. Just a woman crying on the phone because something inside her was saying, stop. And for once, I listened. I did not override it. I did not tell myself I needed more proof. I did not force myself to stay until something terrible happened so that I could finally justify leaving. I listened and I left. And at the time, I believed that was the end. I genuinely believed that man would simply become one of those people you once knew. A chapter that closed before it became something bigger. And maybe that was all it was supposed to be. A warning, a lesson, a door I had enough sense to close. So life moved on. I moved on. Years passed. I continued rebuilding. I continued living. I continued becoming. And that sentence I had said to him disappeared into the background of my memory. You can never truly know a man until you marry him and have nowhere else to go. I did not know that years later, I would remember it differently because more than 3 years passed. And then one day, I saw his number and I said hello. I was the one who said hello. And that is where the second chapter of the story begins. Because this time, I would stay in the conversation long enough to understand why I had cried the first time. And the warning I couldn't explain would begin to explain itself.